Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a new episode of Great Books in 10 Minutes. By the end of this video, you will learn everything about George Orwell's important book, 1984. Before we start, if you haven't downloaded it yet, the free companion app for this channel is available on both the Apple Store and Google Play Store. With this app, you'll get access to bonus content, trivia quizzes tailored to each episode, and a free ebook library to deepen your understanding of the classics. To download, simply scan the QR codes with your phone or click the links in the description box below. The story of George Orwell's 1984 begins on a cold April day in 1984, when a man named Winston Smith made his way back to his home, a rundown apartment building known as Victory Mansions. Winston was thin, frail, and 39 years old, and each step up the stairs was a painful struggle due to a varicose ulcer on his right ankle. The building's elevator was perpetually out of order, so he didn't bother trying to use it. As he ascended the staircase, he was met on every landing by a poster displaying a massive face with the ominous slogan, "Big Brother is watching you." Winston was a minor official in the party, the totalitarian regime that governed all of Airstrip 1, the territory once known as England, within the larger superstate of Oceania. Despite being part of the ruling class, Winston's life was tightly controlled by the party's oppressive power. Inside his apartment, a device called a telescreen constantly blared propaganda and served as a tool for the thought police to monitor citizens' actions. From his window, he could see the Ministry of Truth, the government building where he worked as a propaganda officer, rewriting historical records to align with the party's official narrative. Winston reflected on the other ministries, the Ministry of Peace, which conducted war, the Ministry of Plenty, which orchestrated economic shortages, and the dreaded Ministry of Love, the headquarters of the party's most feared activities. Winston retrieved a small diary from a hidden alcove in his apartment, safely out of view of the telescreen. He had purchased the diary from a second-hand shop in the proletarian district, where the impoverished proles lived with minimal party interference. The party considered the proles too poor and insignificant to pose any real threat to its dominance. As Winston began to write in the diary, he was acutely aware that this act constituted a rebellious defiance against the party. He recounted the films he had watched the previous night and reflected on his intense feelings of hatred and lust toward a dark-haired woman who worked in the fiction department at the Ministry of Truth. He also thought about O'Brien, a prominent inner party member whom Winston suspected shared his disdain for the party. Winston recalled the moments before the daily 2 Minutes Hate, a gathering where party speakers incited the masses into a frenzy of hatred against Oceania's enemies. Just before the hate began, Winston realized he despised Big Brother, and he sensed a similar hatred in O'Brien's eyes. As Winston looked down, he was startled to see that he had repeatedly written "down with Big Brother" in his diary. He had committed thought crime, the gravest offense in the eyes of the party, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the thought police came for him. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Winston, with his heart pounding, reluctantly opened the door, fully expecting the thought police to be on the other side, ready to arrest him for his dangerous act of writing in his diary. To his relief, it was only Mrs. Parsons, a neighbor from the same decrepit apartment building, who had come to ask for his help with a plumbing issue while her husband was away. As Winston entered Mrs. Parsons' apartment, he was immediately assaulted by the presence of her two young children who were anything but innocent. These junior spies, as they were called, had been indoctrinated by the party to vigilantly monitor adults for any signs of disloyalty, often with chilling success. The children were wild-eyed and brimming with fervor, even going so far as to accuse Winston of thought crime, their piercing eyes making him uneasy. Mrs. Parsons herself appeared terrified of her own offspring, whose loyalty to the party far outweighed their familial ties. The children were in a frenzy, frustrated that their mother wouldn't allow them to attend the public hanging of the party's enemies in the park that evening, a spectacle they were eager to witness. Back in the relative safety of his own apartment, Winston's mind drifted back to a dream he once had. In it he had heard a man's voice, O'Brien's voice, he believed, whispering to him, "We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness." The words echoed ominously in Winston's thoughts as he sat down to write in his diary once more. He scribbled down the grim truth that by committing thought crime, he had effectively signed his own death warrant. With a sense of finality, Winston hid the diary away, knowing that it was only a matter of time before his fate caught up with him. The story continued with Winston drifting into a haunting dream, where he found himself aboard a sinking ship with his mother. The memory was murky, yet the feeling of guilt was sharp. He blamed himself for his mother's disappearance nearly 2 decades ago, a casualty of the ruthless political purges that had shaped his life. The dream shifted, transporting him to a place he called the Golden Country, a lush, serene landscape where the dark-haired girl from his waking life suddenly appeared. She shed her clothes and ran toward him, a pure and defiant act of liberation that seemed to obliterate the party's oppressive grip in a single moment. As he awakened, the word Shakespeare escaped his lips, though he had no idea why. A sharp whistle pierced the air, blaring from the ever-present telescreen, signaling that it was time for the office workers to rise. The dreaded physical jerks, a round of painful and humiliating exercises awaited him. As Winston grudgingly began the exercises, his thoughts drifted back to his fragmented childhood, a time shrouded in confusion and half-remembered images. Without tangible records, no photographs, no documents, it felt as though his past had dissolved, leaving only vague impressions. He mused over Oceania's ever-shifting alliances with the other superstates, Eurasia and East Asia. The party's official history claimed Oceania had always been at war with Eurasia and allied with East Asia. Yet Winston knew the truth. The records had been altered countless times. He also recalled that before 1960, no one had ever heard of Big Brother, the party's enigmatic leader. But now history books claimed he had existed since the 1930s, rewriting the past to suit the party's narrative. Just as these rebellious thoughts swirled in his mind, the telescreen's harsh voice suddenly singled him out, chastising him for not putting enough effort into the exercises. Panic surged through Winston as he broke out in a sweat, desperately straining to touch his toes, knowing that even the slightest hint of nonconformity could be his undoing. Winston headed to his job in the records department of the Ministry of Truth, a place where the past was meticulously rewritten to serve the present. His day began with the familiar routine of speaking into a speakwrite, a machine that obediently transcribed his words as he systematically destroyed outdated documents. His task was simple but unnerving: to alter history so that Big Brother's proclamations always aligned with reality, or rather, with the reality the party wished to project. In Oceania, the truth was as malleable as clay in the hands of the party, and today's lies were tomorrow's unquestionable facts. That day, Winston was assigned to revise a speech delivered in December 1983, where Big Brother had once praised Comrade Withers, a high-ranking official who had since been vaporized, erased from existence as if he had never lived. Withers, now branded a traitor, could not be allowed to exist even in memory, and so Winston was tasked with expunging him from the records. To fill the void left by Withers, Winston conjured up Comrade Ogilvy, a fictional party loyalist crafted from thin air. Comrade Ogilvy was the epitome of what the party valued: celibate, suspicious, and utterly devoid of personal desires. He was the perfect servant to the party, though he never drew breath. Withers, now an unperson, had been erased not only from history, but from existence itself. As Winston watched his colleague Comrade Tillotson in the neighboring cubicle, he reflected on the sheer scale of the ministry's operation. Thousands of workers like himself labored day in and day out to reshape the past, ensuring that every detail fit the party's ever-changing narrative. The Ministry of Truth was a vast machine churning out revised histories, propaganda, and even pornography, all designed to keep the destitute masses pacified. The real truth was buried beneath layers of falsehoods, and Winston was one of the many hands digging the grave. Winston sat down for lunch with Syme, a sharp and ambitious party member who was deeply engrossed in his work on the latest edition of Newspeak, Oceania's official language. As they ate, Syme excitedly explained how Newspeak was designed to constrict the range of thought itself, making the very concept of rebellion unthinkable. By systematically removing words that could express dissenting ideas, the party ensured that no one could even entertain the notion of defying it. Winston listened, recognizing the chilling brilliance in Syme's logic, but couldn't help but think that his colleague's intellectual acumen might one day lead him to be erased from existence by the party. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Parsons, a stout and fervent party official whose wife Winston had helped with the plumbing. Parsons, beaming with enthusiasm, requested a contribution from Winston for the upcoming Hate Week, a community event designed to stir up anti-enemy sentiment. Despite his earlier apology for the unsettling behavior of his children, Parsons proudly lauded their zealous commitment to the party's cause. Suddenly, the loudspeakers crackled to life with a jubilant announcement from the Ministry of Plenty, proclaiming a significant boost in production. The announcement boasted an increase in the chocolate ration to 20 grams. Winston, however, knew this supposed increase was nothing more than a reduction from the previous day's already meager ration. Yet those around him accepted the announcement with cheerful disbelief, their enthusiasm for the party's propaganda evident. As Winston contemplated this absurdity, he sensed an unsettling presence. Looking up, he caught the gaze of the dark-haired girl from the fiction department who was watching him intently. A fresh wave of anxiety washed over him. He worried that she might be another covert agent of the party, spying on him for signs of disloyalty. That evening, Winston retreated to his diary, driven by the need to capture his memories of a recent, grimly significant encounter. He wrote about his last sexual experience with a prole prostitute, a woman from the lower class who, in his eyes, was far from desirable. The party despised sex not merely for its own sake, but because it sought to strip away all pleasure, transforming the act into nothing more than a mechanical duty to produce new party members. Winston reflected on his previous marriage to Catherine, a union that fell apart once they realized their childless future was inevitable. Catherine, who shared the party's disdain for sex, had no interest in the act, further straining their relationship. Their separation was a direct result of this lack of intimacy and connection. Now Winston clung to the hope that a truly pleasurable sexual affair could serve as an ultimate act of rebellion. Yet, as he wrote in his diary, he admitted that the prostitute he chose was old and unattractive, a stark contrast to the forbidden pleasure he yearned for. He acknowledged that recording this experience in his diary had not eased his anger or despair, nor had it quelled his rebellious spirit. Despite his attempts to find solace in these private confessions, he remained consumed by the urge to scream out his frustration and rage against the oppressive world around him. In his diary, Winston reflected on the bleak reality of his situation. He wrote that if there was any hope for a revolution against the party, it must come from the proles. He was convinced that the party's destruction could not originate from within its own ranks. Even the fabled Brotherhood, a secretive revolutionary group, seemed powerless against the all-seeing thought police. The proles, who made up a staggering 85% of Oceania's population, could potentially overthrow the regime with their sheer numbers and strength. However, they led lives of such brutish ignorance and apathy that they lacked the will or awareness to rise up. To understand the true nature of the world, Winston flipped through a children's history book. The party boasted of having created ideal cities, but London, where Winston resided, was a crumbling mess. Electricity was unreliable, buildings fell into disrepair, and the populace endured relentless poverty and fear. Without a trustworthy historical record, Winston was left in the dark about the past. The party's claims of improved literacy rates, reduced infant mortality, and better living conditions could well be fabrications. Although Winston suspected these claims were false, he lacked the means to verify them, as history had been completely rewritten by the party. Winston recalled a moment when he caught the party in a blatant lie. In the mid-1960s, during a period of cultural upheaval, the original leaders of the revolution were arrested. One day, Winston spotted some of these ousted leaders at the Chestnut Tree Cafe, a haunt for disgraced party members. As a song played with the lyrics, "Under the spreading chestnut tree, I sold you and you sold me," one of the former leaders, Rutherford, broke down in tears. The scene left a lasting impression on Winston, who later discovered a photograph proving that these party members had been in New York while they were supposedly committing treason in Eurasia. Terrified, Winston destroyed the photograph but could not erase the memory of this concrete example of party deceit. Winston viewed his diary as a letter to O'Brien, a man he knew little about beyond his name, but whom he sensed shared a spark of rebellion. He believed O'Brien possessed an anti-regime sentiment similar to his own. As he contemplated the party's manipulation of truth, Winston realized that the regime forced its members to deny the evidence of their senses. He was convinced that true freedom lay in the ability to recognize and accept reality as one perceived it, to be able to assert 2 + 2 = 4. Winston set out on a walk through the Prole district, finding himself envious of the seemingly straightforward lives of the common people. The Proles, living in relative ignorance, appeared to be untouched by the party's relentless surveillance and control. Winston stepped into a dimly lit pub, seeking a glimpse into the past. There he encountered an elderly man whose weathered face hinted at a life lived long before the party's rise. Winston hoped to glean insights into the world before the party's cruel reign, curious whether the past was as harsh and exploitative as the party's records suggested. However, the old man's memories were murky and fragmented, failing to provide the clarity Winston sought. Disheartened, Winston reflected that the true history had been left to the Proles, who, in their ignorance, were bound to forget it altogether. From there, Winston headed back to the second-hand store where he had purchased his diary. He bought a delicate glass paperweight with a pink coral center from Mr. Charrington, the store's owner. Mr. Charrington led him upstairs to a quaint room that was refreshingly free of telescreens. The room was adorned with a print of St. Clement's Church, and the old rhyme about the bells of St. Clement's and St. Martin's lingered in the air. On his way home, Winston caught sight of a figure clad in blue party overalls, the dark-haired girl from the fiction department who seemed to be following him. A surge of panic gripped him as he contemplated violent actions, imagining using a cobblestone or the paperweight as a weapon. He rushed back to his apartment, overwhelmed by the thought of facing the thought police. Winston considered ending his own life as a means to escape the inevitable torture and death that awaited him should he be caught. His thoughts turned to O'Brien and the cryptic promise of a place where there was no darkness, a beacon of hope in his troubled dreams. Desperate for comfort, he pulled a coin from his pocket and gazed at the stern visage of Big Brother. The party's slogans echoed in his mind: "War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength," each phrase a haunting reminder of the twisted reality he was trapped in. One morning at work, Winston was heading toward the men's room when he caught sight of the dark-haired girl from the fiction department. As the girl drew closer, Winston noticed her right arm was in a sling, cleverly blending in with her overalls and barely visible from a distance. He figured she must have injured her hand while maneuvering one of the large kaleidoscopes in the fiction department, where plots for novels were hastily sketched out. It was a frequent mishap among the workers there. They were only about 4 meters apart when the girl suddenly stumbled and fell, nearly crashing face first onto the ground. A sharp cry of pain escaped her lips, the agony clear as she must have landed directly on her already injured arm. Winston rushed to help her up. In that fleeting moment, she slipped him a note. His heart raced as he unfolded it to read the unexpected words, "I love you." Winston was stunned. For a long time he had been wary of this girl, convinced she might be a political spy sent to monitor him. But there she was, declaring her love. The note's message stirred a tumultuous storm within him, filled with confusion and hope. Before he could fully grasp the implications of this revelation, Parsons, ever the enthusiastic party member, interrupted with chatter about his preparations for the upcoming hate week. Despite the intrusion, the note from the dark-haired girl ignited in Winston a newfound and intense will to live. Over the next few days, Winston was a bundle of nerves, avoiding any direct communication with the girl. Finally, he mustered the courage to sit at the same lunchroom table as her. They spoke in hushed tones, heads bowed to avoid drawing attention. They arranged to meet in Victory Square, a place where they could blend into the crowd and escape the prying eyes of the telescreens. When they met in the square, the atmosphere was tense. They witnessed a convoy of Eurasian prisoners being harassed by a vicious mob, a grim reminder of the party's cruelty. Amid the chaos, the girl whispered directions to Winston for their secret rendezvous. She told him to catch a train from Paddington Station to a remote spot in the countryside. Despite the surroundings and the ever-present danger, they managed to hold hands briefly, their connection, a fleeting, precious respite from the relentless surveillance and control of their world. Winston, his heart racing with anticipation, followed through with the plan as he and the dark-haired girl finally met in the countryside. Although he was still uncertain about what to expect, his earlier fears that she might be a party spy had begun to dissipate. He remained cautious, his eyes scanning the surroundings for hidden microphones in the bushes, but he found solace in the girl's calm and confident demeanor. Winston took the girl's hand and, with a hint of surprise, admitted that until that moment he hadn't noticed the color of her eyes. Now he saw that they were a light shade of brown with dark lashes. Winston confessed that he was 39 years old, trapped in a marriage he couldn't escape, plagued by varicose veins, and burdened with 5 false teeth. The girl, who later introduced herself as Julia, was unfazed and told him she couldn't care less. Julia then, with a decisive gesture, ripped off her junior anti-sex league sash, a symbol of her prior allegiance to the party's repressive rules. The act felt liberating to Winston, who now saw a side of Julia that defied the party's constraints. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the tension between them became palpable. When they finally embraced, it was an experience that surpassed even Winston's most fervent dreams. The act of making love was a powerful, almost euphoric rebellion against the party's cold, controlling ideology. Afterward, as they lay together in the forest's embrace, Winston's curiosity led him to ask Julia if she had had similar encounters before. She admitted, with a mixture of nonchalance and defiance, that she had been with numerous men. This revelation delighted Winston. The idea that Julia had shared her defiance with many others only deepened his affection for her. To him, her numerous past lovers symbolized a broader rebellion against the party's cruel norms and an act of subversive resistance. As soon as Julia had woken up, her demeanor shifted to one of alertness and efficiency. She quickly dressed, tied the scarlet sash around her waist, and began planning their journey home. Winston left the details to her, recognizing her practical cunning and extensive knowledge of the countryside around London, gained from countless community hikes. She outlined a different route for Winston, leading him to a separate railway station, and advised him never to return home the same way he had come. Julia instructed Winston to wait half an hour before leaving and mentioned a place where they could meet after work in 4 days. It was a busy street in a poorer area filled with market stalls. Julia planned to blend in by pretending to shop for shoelaces or thread. If it was safe to talk when Winston approached, she would discreetly blow her nose. Otherwise, he was to walk past her without acknowledgement. If all went well, they should have about 15 minutes to arrange their next meeting amidst the crowd. She and Winston eventually resumed their routine lives, though their clandestine meetings continued in the shadows of the city. Over the next few weeks, their encounters were brief but intense, each one steeped in secrecy. One day, they met in the hushed remains of a crumbling church. Amid the whispers of its decay, Julia shared with Winston the details of her life in a hostel, where she lived with 30 other girls. She recounted her first forbidden sexual encounter with a sense of both excitement excitement and detachment. Unlike Winston, who yearned for a broader rebellion, Julia's desires were more immediate and personal. Her thrill came from outsmarting the party and indulging in forbidden pleasures. She revealed to Winston that the party's ban on sex was not just about control, but a strategic move to redirect the citizens' sexual frustration into intense hostility toward party enemies and fervent adoration of Big Brother. Winston, in turn, opened up about a disturbing memory from his past. He described a walk he had taken with his former wife, Catherine, during which he had fantasized about pushing her off a cliff. To Winston, it would have made little difference whether he had actually followed through with the act. The forces that dominated their lives rendered any individual rebellion meaningless in the face of their overwhelming control. Winston surveyed the small, shabby room above Mr. Charrington's shop, a place he had rented for what he now saw as a foolish affair with Julia. At that moment, Winston remembered that Mr. Charrington had easily agreed to rent the room to him, clearly pleased with the extra money it would bring him. He hadn't seemed shocked or acted suspiciously when he realized Winston wanted the room for a love affair. Outside, a burly woman with red arms had hung her laundry to dry, her off-key singing drifting through the window. Winston and Julia had been caught up in the whirlwind of preparations for Hate Week, which left them frustrated by their infrequent meetings. Winston yearned for a simpler, more romantic existence with Julia, something akin to the comfortable routine of an old married couple. Julia arrived with a small treasure trove: sugar, coffee, and bread, luxuries typically reserved for the inner party elite. She applied her makeup, and her vibrant beauty and femininity left Winston breathless. As they relaxed in bed later that evening, Julia noticed the paperweight on the table and asked about it. Winston explained that the paperweight symbolized a connection to the past, a relic from a time before the party's dominance. They began to sing a nostalgic song about St. Clement's Church, and Julia mentioned her plan to clean the old picture of the church someday. After Julia departed, Winston remained alone, lost in thought. He gazed at the crystal paperweight, imagining a life trapped within its fragile sphere, an eternal sanctuary where he and Julia could exist forever, untouched by the world outside. As Winston had feared, Syme vanished without warning. One morning he simply didn't show up for work, prompting a few careless remarks from his colleagues. By the next day, no one mentioned him at all. On the third day, Winston visited the vestibule of the records department to check the notice board. Among the notices was a printed list of the chess committee members, which had previously included Syme. The list looked almost identical to how it had before. Nothing was crossed out, but now it was one name shorter. The city, now throbbing with the heat of summer, buzzed with frenetic energy as Hate Week approached. Parsons, ever the enthusiastic party supporter, adorned every available surface with colorful ribbons, while his children enthusiastically belted out a new anthem, aptly named Hate Song, dedicated to the upcoming event. Winston's thoughts, however, were preoccupied with the room above Mr. Charrington's shop. His love for this room grew daily, consuming his mind even when he was unable to visit. He imagined scenarios where his wife Catherine met an untimely end, freeing him to marry Julia, and even dreamed of reinventing himself as one of the proles, living a life free from the party's suffocating grip. In their secret meetings, Winston and Julia discussed the mysterious brotherhood. Winston shared his unsettling sense of connection with O'Brien, whom he suspected might be secretly against the party. Julia, however, dismissed these concerns with a casual air, suggesting that the war and enemies like Emmanuel Goldstein were merely fabrications of the party itself. Her indifferent attitude and apparent lack of deep concern irritated Winston. He reproached her, accusing her of being a rebel only in the most superficial ways, with her defiance restricted to physical pleasures rather than meaningful resistance. Winston's long-held anticipation finally materialized when he encountered O'Brien, the enigmatic figure he had been waiting for his entire life. The meeting took place in a dimly lit hallway at the Ministry of Truth, where the air was thick with the weight of secrecy. Winston's emotions were a whirlwind of anxiety and exhilaration as he stood face to face with the man who represented both hope and fear. O'Brien's demeanor was as elusive as ever, but his words offered a glimmer of promise. He cryptically mentioned Syme, a colleague who had mysteriously disappeared, and then casually suggested that Winston might be interested in seeing a Newspeak dictionary if he visited O'Brien's residence one evening. This offhand invitation felt like a momentous event to Winston, who sensed that this encounter was a pivotal step in the journey he had begun the day he first questioned the party's omnipotence. As he left the hallway, Winston was engulfed by a dark foreboding. The path he was now on, marked by this significant meeting with O'Brien, seemed inexorably tied to his eventual fate at the Ministry of Love. He grimly contemplated that this path could very well lead to his own demise. Despite the shadow of impending doom, Winston was exhilarated by the prospect of visiting O'Brien's home. The address O'Brien had given him felt like a lifeline, a beacon of possibility amidst the suffocating darkness of his world. One morning, Winston jolted awake, tears streaming down his face, in the room above Mr. Charrington's quaint antiques shop. Julia, who was beside him, gently asked what was troubling him. Through his tears, Winston revealed a haunting dream about his mother, a dream that had forced him to confront a buried guilt he had never fully acknowledged. He confessed that until that moment, he had harbored a subconscious belief that he was somehow responsible for her death. A flood of repressed memories crashed over him. Winston recalled the chaotic and desperate atmosphere of his childhood, marked by the constant threat of air raids, long lines for food, and the distant sounds of machine gun fire. He remembered scavenging with other boys, searching through garbage for scraps of food, and waiting by the roadside for trucks carrying cattle feed, hoping for any spillage. His father's disappearance had left his mother emotionally drained and lifeless, moving mechanically through daily chores while nursing his sickly younger sister. Driven by an insatiable hunger, Winston fought relentlessly for his share of the meager food, often taking more than his fair portion and neglecting his sister's needs. One day, when a rare chocolate ration was issued, Winston selfishly demanded the entire portion for himself. After a heated argument, his mother reluctantly gave him the majority, leaving only a small piece for his sister. In a moment of uncontrollable greed, Winston snatched the remaining chocolate from his sister and ran away, ignoring his mother's pleas to return. As he fled, he sensed that something terrible was imminent, feeling an overwhelming guilt as he realized that his sister might be dying, yet he could not bring himself to go back. The party's relentless suppression of human emotions had left him bitter and resentful. He loathed how the party had stripped away the very essence of human connection and warmth. To him, the proles remained the last bastion of genuine humanity, while party members like himself and Julia had been forced into an emotional desolation that felt almost inhuman. The weight of their situation pressed heavily upon them. Winston and Julia both understood the grim reality. If they were caught, they faced a future of torture and death. The thought of their sanctuary, the room above Mr. Charrington's shop, being a potential trap only heightened their anxiety. They exchanged uneasy reassurances, clinging to the belief that while the party's torture might force them to confess their darkest secrets, it could not extinguish the love they shared. Despite their mutual agreement that abandoning the room would be the safest choice, they found themselves unable to leave, their love and fear entwined in a precarious balance. Winston and Julia embarked on a daring journey to O'Brien's luxurious apartment, fully aware of the perilous nature of their decision. Upon entering the opulent space, they were immediately struck by the stark contrast to their grim reality. O'Brien, with a knowing smile, surprised them by turning off the telescreen, an act of rebellion that signified their brief respite from the party's all-seeing eye. Feeling a surge of exhilaration and liberation, Winston boldly asserted that he and Julia were enemies of the party, seeking to join the elusive brotherhood. O'Brien's reaction was both reassuring and electrifying. O'Brien's servant, a man named Martin, brought them drinks. O'Brien poured a dark red liquid into the glasses and with a faint smile revealed that it was called wine, something Winston had only read about in books. He explained that it was rare for the outer party to have access to it. With a solemn expression, O'Brien then raised his glass and proposed a toast. to our leader, to Emmanuel Goldstein. Winston curiously asked O'Brien if Emmanuel Goldstein and the resistance were real. O'Brien confirmed that the Brotherhood was real. Emmanuel Goldstein existed, and he was indeed alive. After a series of questions through which O'Brien tested Winston's dedication to the cause of the revolution, he reminded them that they would fight in the dark against a powerful enemy, and that when they received orders, they must obey them. As the evening unfolded, O'Brien poured them more wine, and Winston, filled with nostalgia and hope, proposed a toast to the past, a tribute to memories and ideals that seemed almost forgotten. Julia soon excused herself, and O'Brien promised Winston a copy of Goldstein's book, the manifesto that encapsulated the revolutionary ideology they longed to embrace. He also hinted at the possibility of their paths crossing again in the future. When Winston inquired whether O'Brien meant their meeting would happen in the place where there is no darkness, O'Brien confirmed with a cryptic nod, repeating the phrase. After an exhausting 90-hour work week, Winston had barely been holding on. During Hate Week, the party's frantic pace had intensified, with Oceania abruptly switching its enemies and allies in the never-ending war. This sudden change had landed Winston with an overwhelming amount of work to manage, as the party scrambled to adjust its propaganda. At one rally, the chaos had been palpable as the speaker abruptly shifted his speech halfway through. The crowd had been informed that Oceania was not, and had never been, at war with Eurasia. Instead, Oceania had always been locked in battle with East Asia. The crowd, previously waving signs denouncing Eurasia, had suddenly felt confused and shifted the blame to Emmanuel Goldstein's agents for the mix-up. Despite the confusion, their fervor against East Asia had remained unshaken. Later, in the sanctuary of Mr. Charrington's room, Winston had dived into Goldstein's The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism, a book given to him by O'Brien. The book had been dense and daunting, its chapters echoing the party's slogans like "War is peace and ignorance is strength." It had outlined a chilling theory of social stratification across recent history: the inner party, the outer party, and the proles. According to Goldstein, Eurasia had been formed when Russia absorbed all of Europe, Oceania had been established when the United States took over the British Empire, and East Asia comprised the remaining nations. These three superstates perpetuated a never-ending border conflict to maintain their power, as no two allies could overpower the third. This perpetual war, Goldstein had argued, was designed to keep the masses ignorant of life outside their borders, illustrating the true meaning of war is peace. Winston paused his reading as the distant roar of a rocket bomb echoed in the background. The joy of being alone with the forbidden book in a room free of telescreens still lingered. He felt a deep sense of solitude and safety, mingled with the comfort of his tired body, the softness of the chair, and the gentle breeze from the window against his cheek. The book captivated him, not with new information, but with reassurance. It reflected his own scattered thoughts, presenting them in a more coherent and powerful manner. Winston realized that the best books are those that resonate with what one already knows. As Winston read, Julia entered the room and lay in bed next to him. After spending half an hour in bed together with the distant sound of a woman singing outside, Winston read aloud to Julia from Goldstein's manifesto. The book revealed that controlling history was a crucial tactic of the party, with doublethink allowing inner party members to be the most fervent supporters of the war mentality, despite knowing the historical narratives they propagated were false. Doublethink meant the act of simultaneously accepting two contradictory beliefs as true, even if they conflicted with one's own memory or sense of reality. Eventually, Winston had checked to see if Julia was still awake. She was not, and he had drifted off to sleep. His final thought had lingered on the unsettling notion that sanity is not statistical. The next morning, as Winston lay in bed, the shrill voice of the woman outside began to sing, piercing the quiet of dawn and waking Julia from her sleep. Through the grimy window, Winston gazed at the woman, struck by her robust vitality. Winston contemplated that from his love with Julia, no child would ever be born, and compared that with the woman singing carelessly in the yard, wondering how many children she might have given birth to. He reminisced about the thrush that had sung to them on their first day by the edge of the wood. Julia dismissed the memory, stating that the bird had sung for its own pleasure, not for them. Winston reflected on the contrast between the party's lack of song and the joy of the proles and birds across the world, from London to Paris and beyond. He daydreamed of a time when the proles, those seemingly insignificant masses, might awaken to their own power and rise against the party's grip. In their shared moment of reflection, Winston and Julia both acknowledged their grim reality. "We are the dead," they murmured in unison, recognizing their fated doom. But then from the shadows, a chilling voice interrupted their resignation with the grim statement, "You are the dead." The words sent a shiver down their spines as they suddenly realized the truth. A telescreen, cleverly concealed behind a picture of St. Clement's Church, had been eavesdropping on their every word. From that moment onward, until the thought police broke in, every word they spoke was repeated back to them from the telescreen. Panic seized them as the rhythmic pounding of boots filled the air. The house was surrounded. A haunting voice began reciting the final lines of the St. Clement's rhyme. "Here comes a candle to light you to bed. Here comes a chopper to chop off your head." The window shattered in a shower of glass, and the regime's troops stormed into the room, their presence like a dark tide. In the chaos, the troops smashed the delicate paperweight that had once seemed so symbolic to Winston. As he watched its fragments scatter across the floor, he was struck by the irony of its smallness in the face of his colossal fear. The troops violently kicked Winston and beat Julia, leaving him disoriented. As Winston struggled and the troops restrained him, Mr. Charrington, his seemingly benign landlord, entered the room. Mr. Charrington, once a symbol of resistance and safety, now commanded one of the troops to gather the shards of the shattered paperweight. The horrifying realization dawned on Winston. Mr. Charrington's voice had been the one coming from the telescreen all along. He was, in fact, a member of the thought police, and the illusion of sanctuary they had clung to had been nothing more than a trap. Winston found himself in a high-ceilinged, windowless cell, presumably within the Ministry of Love, though he could not be certain. The walls were made of gleaming white porcelain, and cold light from hidden lamps illuminated the space. A constant low humming filled the room, likely related to the air supply. A narrow bench encircled the walls, interrupted only by the door and the lavatory pan at the far end, which lacked a wooden seat. 4 telescreens were mounted on the walls, one on each. At that moment, Winston remembered the promise of the place where there is no darkness. He had been moved from a previous cell where he had been kept alongside a colossal prole woman who, to his dismay, wondered aloud if she might be his mother. In his new solitary cell, Winston's mind was plagued by visions of his tormentors. He shuddered at the thought of them inflicting unimaginable pain upon him, fearing that such suffering might eventually force him to betray Julia, the one person he held dear. Winston then hoped that O'Brien had found out about his arrest and would send him a razor blade to help him take his own life. The cell door clanked open, and in stumbled Ampleforth, a poet condemned for leaving the word God in his translation of a poem. Ampleforth was quickly dragged away to the dreaded room 101, a place whispered about with dread, its horrors known only to those who had faced it. Winston was shocked when Parsons was shoved into the cell. Parsons, almost in tears, admitted he was there for thought crime. He was bewildered that such an accusation could apply to him, yet he quickly confessed, desperately asking Winston if he thought they would shoot him. Parsons clung to the belief that the party would recognize his loyalty, pleading that he had always tried his best for them. He hoped for a lighter sentence, perhaps 5 or 10 years in a labor camp, convinced they would not execute him for one mistake. Winston asked if Parsons was guilty, and Parsons, glancing nervously at the telescreen, insisted he was. After all, the party wouldn't arrest an innocent man. He explained that thought crime had crept up on him in his sleep, where he had unconsciously repeated "down with Big Brother" over and over. Parsons was oddly relieved that the party had caught him before it went further and planned to thank them at his tribunal. When Winston asked who had turned Parsons in, Parsons, with a mix of pride and sorrow, revealed that it was his 7-year-old daughter. She had overheard him through the keyhole and reported him to the authorities, an act that Parsons, despite everything, felt proud of, believing it showed he had raised her in the right spirit. The sight of his former neighbor, once so zealous in his loyalty to the party, now broken and defeated, deepened Winston's despair. As the days stretched on, Winston's hopes were shattered when O'Brien, the very figure he had counted on as his ally in the rebellion, walked into the cell. O'Brien revealed himself as an operative of the Ministry of Love, the very institution Winston had hoped to resist. O'Brien asserted that Winston must have known all along a grim truth that Winston reluctantly acknowledged. As a guard ruthlessly smashed Winston's elbow, the excruciating pain drove home a grim realization. No one could maintain heroism in the face of such physical agony. The suffering was simply too overwhelming. O'Brien presided over Winston's relentless torture sessions with a cold, calculating demeanor. Each session was a grueling ordeal designed to break Winston's spirit and force him into submission. Over time, the beatings became less frequent, replaced by a persistent threat that kept Winston in constant fear. His new interrogators were party intellectuals, short, swift men with glasses, who interrogated him for hours, using minor yet ongoing pain and humiliation to wear down his resolve. Their questioning involved demeaning tactics designed to destabilize his thinking and force him to admit contradictions. At times, they shifted their approach, appealing to his loyalty to Ingsoc and Big Brother, urging him to correct his perceived wrongs. Despite their harsh methods, these appeals occasionally brought him to tears. The relentless psychological pressure proved more effective than physical torture, eventually breaking his will. Winston found himself confessing to a litany of crimes: murder, espionage, embezzlement. Regardless of their truth, he admitted to being a spy, a believer in religion, a fan of capitalism, and even a killer of his still-living wife. In his shattered state, it seemed easier to confess to everything and implicate everyone, blurring the line between reality and fabrication. O'Brien accused Winston of the gravest sin, refusing to bow to the party's absolute authority over history and personal memory. After days of brutal beating and torture, as the pain intensified, Winston was coerced into acknowledging a twisted reality. He was forced to concede that whatever O'Brien demanded him to believe was the truth. At times, the temporary relief from pain, however, made O'Brien seem like a savior, and Winston even convinced himself that O'Brien wasn't the cause of his suffering. O'Brien informed Winston that his current state of mind was nothing short of madness. However, he assured Winston that the torture would ultimately cure him of his insanity. He elaborated on the party's mastery of suppression and control, explaining that they had refined the methods of the Inquisition, the Nazis, and the Soviets. The party's approach didn't merely eliminate enemies, it transformed them, erasing their existence from public memory. Winston began to grasp the concept of doublethink, the party's practice of holding two contradictory beliefs simultaneously. He learned to dismiss memories he knew to be true, adapting to the party's warped version of reality. When O'Brien offered to answer Winston's questions, Winston, desperate for some semblance of truth, asked about Julia. O'Brien coldly revealed that Julia had betrayed him the moment she had the chance. Winston then questioned whether Big Brother existed in the same tangible sense that he himself did. O'Brien chillingly responded that Winston in fact did not exist. When Winston inquired about the mysterious brotherhood, O'Brien cryptically stated that Winston would never learn the answer to that question. Finally, when Winston asked what horrors awaited him in room 101, O'Brien ominously replied that everyone already knew what lurked in room 101. After Winston endured weeks of grueling interrogation and relentless torture, O'Brien explained to him that there were 3 stages in his reintegration: learning, understanding, and acceptance. He told Winston that it was time for him to move on to the second stage. O'Brien revealed that he was the co-author of the revolutionary book with which he had fooled Winston. Winston, depressed and hopeless, asked if what was written in the book was the truth. O'Brien replied that only in description, and that the program described was nothing but nonsense. It promised that secret knowledge would spread, leading to a proletarian uprising and the party's downfall. But this was all absurd. The proletarians would never revolt, not in 1,000 years. The reason was clear and known to all. Any dreams of violent rebellion needed to be abandoned. The party's rule was eternal. This was the starting point for all thoughts. Clinging to a shred of hope, Winston suggested that the party's control over the proles might somehow be for their own benefit. O'Brien, with chilling coldness, mocked this notion, declaring that the party's sole purpose was to achieve absolute, unending, and limitless power. O'Brien told Winston that power was never meant to be given up. It wasn't a means to an end, but an end in itself. A dictatorship wasn't established to protect a revolution. The revolution was made to create the dictatorship. The purpose of persecution and torture was simply to perpetuate them, and the ultimate goal of power was to maintain power. After a lengthy debate in which Winston argued with O'Brien about the survival of the human race and the impossibility of building a civilization based on fear, O'Brien asked Winston if he considered himself morally superior to the party members. When Winston replied yes, O'Brien played a recording of Winston's voice from the night he was initiated into the rebellion. In the recording, Winston had promised to do anything for the cause of the revolution. He had agreed to commit various crimes, including drug use, prostitution, theft, forgery, murder, and other heinous acts. Next, O'Brien called Winston the last of the human race and forced him to confront his reflection in a mirror. The sight was harrowing. Winston had become a mere shadow of his former self. His body wasted away to a gray, skinny shadow of his old self. O'Brien cruelly aimed to break Winston's spirit by telling him that he was deteriorating and falling apart, calling him a bag of filth. He instructed Winston to look in the mirror and see himself as the last man, declaring that if he was human, that was what humanity had become. He then told Winston to put his clothes back on. Overwhelmed by his own disintegration, Winston began to sob, placing the blame squarely on O'Brien. With unsettling calm, O'Brien reminded Winston that his downfall had begun the moment he first put pen to paper in his diary. Despite the agony, Winston felt a fleeting surge of courage and told O'Brien that despite all of that, he had not betrayed Julia. However, O'Brien's words carried a grim finality. He assured Winston that soon enough he would be cured of his rebellious thoughts. But O'Brien's words were not meant to console. Rather, they carried the bitter truth that ultimately everyone's fate was the same. Everyone was ultimately silenced, erased, and shot, regardless of their resistance. In time, Winston found himself relocated to a room with greater comfort, where the relentless torment began to subside. He dreamt peacefully of Julia, his mother, and O'Brien amidst the lush, idyllic landscape of the Golden Country. Gradually, he gained weight and was given a small slate on which to write, a modest relief from his previous suffering. With this newfound liberty, Winston reflected on his solitary rebellion against the party and realized how futile it had been to defy such a powerful force on his own. He started to convince himself of the party's slogans, writing down phrases like "freedom is slavery," "2 and 2 make 5," and "God is power" on his slate. Despite this facade of compliance, a surge of despair overtook Winston one day, leading him to scream Julia's name repeatedly. The outburst terrified him, knowing that such an emotional display would undoubtedly provoke O'Brien's wrath and more torture. Yet, deep inside, Winston clung to his desire to continue hating the party. He struggled to suppress his hatred, hoping that even in death, he would retain his defiance against Big Brother, a personal triumph in his otherwise bleak existence. However, his efforts to hide his true feelings proved in vain. When O'Brien arrived with the guards, Winston could no longer contain his anger. He openly declared his hatred for Big Brother, only to be met with O'Brien's cold response. Obeying Big Brother was not enough, O'Brien said. Winston had to genuinely love him. With this chilling revelation, O'Brien commanded the guards to take Winston to room 101. the place where the party's most terrifying punishments were administered. In the claustrophobic confines of room 101, Winston found himself strapped into a chair, his head clamped rigidly so that he could not move. O'Brien stood over him, a cold, calculating presence. He informed Winston that room 101 held the worst thing in the world, a place where fears were not merely imagined, but made flesh. O'Brien recalled Winston's deepest terror, the nightmare of being in an impenetrable darkness with something monstrous lurking just beyond reach, and revealed that the source of Winston's horror was in fact rats. With a grim smile, O'Brien produced a cage teeming with massive writhing rats, their beady eyes glistening with hunger. He placed the cage ominously close to Winston and then explained that when he activated a lever, a door would open and the rats would pour out, leaping onto Winston's face and devouring him alive. The proximity of the ravenous creatures caused a visceral, primal fear to overtake Winston, his resolve shattered under the imminent threat. Desperate to escape the impending nightmare, Winston screamed through his terror, pleading with O'Brien to inflict this horrific fate upon Julia, the woman he loved. In that moment of abject betrayal, Winston's humanity was exposed as he sacrificed Julia to save himself. O'Brien, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and disdain, removed the cage, leaving Winston a broken man. Winston, now a broken man, found himself seated at the Chestnut Tree Cafe, a dreary haunt for those who had fallen from the party's favor. He sipped on a glass of Victory gin, the bitter liquid burning his throat as he mindlessly watched the telescreen. The once rebellious spark within him had been extinguished. He now accepted every word and action of the party without question. Yet deep within, a lingering unease remained, as though the scent of rats still haunted him, a faint reminder of his ordeal. Absent-mindedly, Winston traced the equation 2 + 2 = 5 in the dust on the table, a grim symbol of his complete surrender to the party's reality. His thoughts drifted back to a cold day in March when he had encountered Julia. Time had changed her. She was now heavier, her once vibrant spirit hardened. The idea of intimacy with her now filled Winston with revulsion. When they met, they admitted to betraying each other under torture, a confession that left them both hollow. They had spoken of meeting again, but the words were empty, devoid of any true desire to rekindle what they once had. As Winston sat in the cafe, a haunting melody played in his mind. Under the spreading chestnut tree, I sold you and you sold me, echoing the betrayal he had witnessed in the eyes of political prisoners who had sat in the very same place years before. The memory brought tears to his eyes, not just for the lost comrades, but for the fragments of his own humanity that had been shattered. He recalled a fleeting moment of happiness with his mother and sister, a memory so vivid yet so distant that he doubted its authenticity. It felt more like a dream than a reality he once lived. Looking up, Winston's gaze fell upon the ever-present image of Big Brother on the telescreen. A wave of warmth and safety washed over him, a twisted comfort in his submission. The news of the ongoing war droned on in the background, but Winston was no longer concerned with the battles outside. The only victory that mattered to him now was the one he had won over himself. He no longer resisted, he no longer questioned. His heart, once filled with defiance, now beat only with love for Big Brother. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed my summary of George Orwell's 1984. Plus, be sure to download our channel's free companion app for access to quizzes, free ebooks, and much more. If you would like to support the channel, consider becoming a member, liking, sharing, and subscribing. Your engagement helps keep this literary conversation going. Until next time, keep reading and exploring the world of words.